I never planned to bring Daniel to the gala. That was the truth, the plain and unglamorous truth. And yet here I was, adjusting the strap of my dress in the mirrored elevator of the Ashford Grand, watching a man I barely knew smooth down his tie like he had something to prove. "You look nervous," he said, not unkindly. "I am," I admitted, and I almost laughed at myself. 28 years old, a marketing coordinator who spent her days chasing invoices and her nights alone with reheated pasta. And somehow I'd ended up on the guest list of the most exclusive charity gala in the city. My best friend Priya had gotten me the ticket, a +1 from her fiancé's law firm. And when she found out I was going stag, she'd practically shoved Daniel, her cousin's roommate, into my path. "He's harmless," she'd said. "He'll make good company. You need to stop hiding, Madison." Maybe she was right. Maybe I had been hiding. Ever since the divorce 2 years ago, I'd built myself a small, safe life out of habits and routines. The same coffee shop every morning, the same 3 restaurants on rotation, the same careful distance from anything that asked too much of me. Safety had started to feel a lot like invisibility, and somewhere in the last year I'd stopped minding, or told myself I had. The elevator doors opened onto marble floors and chandeliers dripping gold light, and the noise of the ballroom rushed toward me all at once. Clinking glasses, a string quartet threading something classical beneath the murmur of 200 conversations, the particular hum of a room full of people who belonged here in a way I wasn't sure I did. I smoothed my dress again, a nervous habit I couldn't seem to break. Daniel offered his arm. I took it, because it seemed like the polite thing to do, not because my hand ached to be there. That was when I felt it. I can't explain it any better than that. A shift in the air, like the temperature had dropped 2 degrees on one side of the room while staying warm everywhere else. I turned my head before I even understood why, some instinct older than reason pulling my attention across the crowd, and that was when I saw him. Taijin. He was standing near the far windows, apart from the crowd the way a lit match is apart from a pool of water, close enough to touch, dangerous enough that no one dared. Black suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone in a way that should have looked casual, and instead looked like a warning, written in a language everyone in that room seemed fluent in except me. 2 men flanked him a respectful 3 feet back, not looking at him, looking at everyone else. The way security does when they're not guarding a person so much as guarding a perimeter around something valuable. I knew him. Of course I knew him. Everyone in this city knew the name Taijin, even if half of them pretended they didn't, dropping their voices when they said it, glancing over their shoulders like the syllables themselves might summon him. I'd met him exactly once, 4 months ago, at a smaller event, a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital where I'd been working the check-in table as a volunteer, handing out name tags and directing lost donors toward the silent auction. He'd signed his name in handwriting so precise it looked engraved, each letter deliberate. And when he'd looked up at me, something had happened in my chest that I still hadn't found the right word for. Not attraction, not exactly. Recognition, maybe. Like meeting someone I'd been warned about my whole life without ever knowing their face, and finding that the warning hadn't prepared me at all. He hadn't said much that night. He never did, from what I'd heard, that he moved through rooms mostly in silence, that his silence carried more weight than most men's shouting. But he'd found reasons to walk past my table twice more before the event ended, and the second time, he'd paused just long enough to say, "You should eat something. You've been standing for 3 hours." I hadn't even realized he'd been counting. I hadn't eaten, in fact. I'd been too nervous, too aware of being somewhere I hadn't quite earned my place in. And the fact that a stranger had noticed what my own exhaustion hadn't told me left something unsettled in me for days afterward. I hadn't seen him since. I told myself I hadn't thought about him either, which was a lie I was getting tired of telling myself in the quiet hours before sleep. Now his eyes found mine across the ballroom, and everything else blurred. The noise, the chandeliers. Daniel's arm looped through mine like an anchor I didn't ask for and wasn't sure I wanted. Taijin didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just looked, the way a man looks at something he's already decided is his, patient and certain, and my skin went warm and cold at the same time, a contradiction I didn't have time to untangle. Then his gaze slid, unhurried, to Daniel's hand resting near my elbow. Something in his jaw changed. Barely. A tightening, a stillness that hadn't been there a second before, so subtle that if I hadn't been staring, I might have missed it entirely. One of the men beside him shifted his weight, as if he'd felt it too. The way you feel a storm coming before the sky changes color, before the wind even picks up. "Do you know him?" Daniel asked, following my stare, his voice carrying the mild curiosity of someone who had no idea what he'd just asked. "Not really," I said, which was true and also wasn't. "He's staring." I noticed. Daniel laughed under his breath, oblivious to the fact that we'd just stepped into water that was far deeper than either of us understood. Water with currents that could pull a person under, before they even realized they were swimming. Should I be worried? I wanted to tell him yes. I wanted to tell him 100 things I couldn't put into words. That the man across the room wasn't someone you accidentally caught the attention of. That there was a reason the crowd around him parted without seeming to notice they were parting. The way water moves around a stone without ever touching it directly. That 4 months ago, I'd spent a week unable to stop thinking about a stranger who'd told me to eat something, replaying 5 words like they meant more than they should have. Instead, I said, "No, let's get a drink." We didn't make it to the bar. A waiter appeared at my elbow so quickly it felt choreographed, holding a single flute of champagne, pale gold, bubbles rising slow and deliberate, like even the drink had been instructed to take its time. "For you," he said. Compliments of Mr. Tajin. I stared at the glass like it might bite me. Daniel's arm had gone rigid under my hand, some primal instinct in him recognizing a challenge even before his mind caught up to what was happening. "I didn't order this," I said, which was a foolish thing to say to a waiter who was only delivering a message, but the words came out before I could stop them. "He said you'd understand," the waiter replied, and then he was gone, melting back into the crowd of black suits and jeweled gowns, leaving me holding a glass I hadn't asked for, and a silence that had somehow gotten louder despite the music still playing around us. I looked up. Tajin hadn't moved from his spot by the window, but he was watching me hold it. Not the champagne. Me, with the kind of patience that made my pulse skip. The patience of a man who had never once in his life needed to hurry. He inclined his head, just slightly, like a man confirming something he already knew, and had simply been waiting for the world to catch up to. "That's a little intense," Daniel muttered, trying to make it a joke. It didn't land as one. It hung there instead, awkward and true. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was apologizing for. For the champagne, for the stare, for something in myself that had gone quiet and alert the moment I'd seen him. I really don't know why he's doing that. Does he do this a lot? Send strange men champagne to warn them off? I almost laughed, except nothing about the look on Tajin's face suggested humor. There was nothing playful in it, nothing that invited me to take it lightly. "I told you, I barely know him. He doesn't look like a man who cares about barely." He wasn't wrong. I set the champagne down on a passing tray without drinking it, some instinct telling me that accepting it fully would mean something I wasn't ready to mean. Wasn't ready to be seen agreeing to in a room full of people who clearly understood rules I hadn't been taught. Daniel's hand found the small of my back, guiding me toward the dance floor instead, away from that corner of the room, and I let him, grateful for an excuse to move, to put bodies and music and motion between myself and those eyes. We danced. It was fine. Pleasant even. Daniel spinning me with more confidence than skill, both of us laughing when I stepped on his foot for the second time. For a few minutes, I almost forgot the weight of those eyes across the room, almost let myself enjoy the ordinary pleasure of being 28 and dressed up and dancing badly with someone who made easy conversation. Almost. Because every time I turned, he was there. Not staring exactly. Worse than staring. Watching, the way you watch weather rolling in, patient and certain it will arrive eventually, no matter how long you pretend otherwise. Once, when Daniel dipped me and I came up laughing, I caught Taejin's gaze and saw something flicker there that I hadn't seen in the volunteer hall 4 months ago. Something sharper. Something that made the hair on my arms rise despite the warmth of the room, despite the sweat gathering at the base of my spine from dancing. The song ended. Daniel excused himself to find us drinks. Real ones this time, he joked. Ones nobody else had ordered. And I was left standing near the edge of the dance floor, catching my breath, fanning myself with one hand, when a voice spoke low behind my shoulder. You didn't drink the champagne. I turned. He was closer than I expected, close enough that I had to tilt my head up to meet his eyes, close enough that the 2 men who'd been flanking him were now a full 10 feet back, giving him a privacy no one else in that ballroom seemed to have been granted all night. I didn't think it was really for me, I said, proud of how steady my voice came out, though my heart was doing something erratic beneath my ribs. It was for you. His tone was quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. Everything I send is for you. You don't know me, Mr. Taejin. I know enough. His eyes moved, unhurried, toward the direction Daniel had disappeared in, then back to me, lingering a beat too long on my face, as if memorizing something. I know you shouldn't have come here with him. My chest tightened, not from fear, though there should have been some of that, from something closer to disbelief, and beneath the disbelief, something warmer and more dangerous that I refused to name. That's not your decision to make. For a moment he didn't answer. The music swelled behind us, distant and strange, like it belonged to a different room entirely, a different night. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped so low only I could hear it, a register meant for exactly one person. No, he agreed. It isn't. Not yet. Then he was gone, folding back into the crowd the way smoke folds into air, leaving me standing there with my heart slamming against my ribs and a single unanswered question circling in my mind, over and over, until Daniel returned with 2 glasses of wine and a smile I couldn't quite return. Not yet. What did that mean? What did any of it mean? The champagne, the stare, the 2 words that had somehow rearranged the air in my lungs. I didn't have an answer. I only knew that whatever door I had just glimpsed opening in that ballroom, I had a terrible, thrilling feeling I wasn't going to be able to close it again, and that some part of me, quiet and unwilling to be honest with itself, didn't entirely want to. Priya cornered me by the coat check before I'd even processed what had just happened, her eyes bright with a kind of gossip hunger I hadn't seen since her own engagement announcement. Okay, what was that? Madison. What was that? I don't know, I said, and it wasn't a deflection this time. I genuinely didn't. My hands were still faintly unsteady as I reached for my coat. You don't know. He sent you champagne in front of your date, in front of everyone. She lowered her voice, glancing past me toward the ballroom doors as if Taejin might materialize out of the marble. Do you understand who that is? I have a general idea. A general idea. She laughed, though there was no humor in it, only disbelief. Madison, that's not a guy you have a general idea about. That's a guy you either know everything about or nothing at all, and there's no safe place in between. I didn't have an answer for that, so I said nothing, and Priya, to her credit, let it go, for the moment. Daniel reappeared with our coats before either of us could say more, his expression carefully neutral in the way of a man trying very hard not to seem rattled. We said our goodbyes to Priya and her fiancé, and I spent the cab ride home listening to Daniel talk about nothing in particular. His job, a hiking trip he was planning, the traffic, while I stared out the window and thought about 2 words spoken so quietly they might have been meant only for the inside of my own head. Not yet. He dropped me at my building with the kind of polite restraint that told me he understood, on some level, that whatever had happened in that ballroom had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with someone else. I had a good time, he said, and he meant it, and I felt a small stab of guilt for how distracted I'd been. Me too, I said, which was almost true. Can I call you? I hesitated a beat too long before saying yes, and I think we both heard the hesitation, though neither of us mentioned it. He kissed my cheek, brief and warm, and I watched the cab pull away before I let myself climb the stairs to my apartment, keys trembling faintly in my hand. Not from fear, not exactly, but from the aftershock of an evening that had rearranged something in me I didn't yet have language for. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept replaying the way Tajin's jaw had tightened when he'd looked at Daniel's hand on my arm, the stillness in him that felt less like anger and more like restraint, like a man holding something back because unleashing it would cost more than it was worth. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I would probably never see him again, that men like that moved through the world on their own orbit, and mine had only briefly, accidentally, crossed his. I was wrong within 4 days. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way except for what happened at the end of it. I worked late finishing a campaign proposal, left the office a little after 7, and walked the 6 blocks to my apartment the way I always did, phone in one hand, keys in the other, half listening to a podcast about historical scandals that I couldn't have summarized to save my life. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes right after rush hour, when the city exhales and hasn't yet decided what to do with itself. That was when I noticed the car. Black, sleek, parked at the curb half a block from my building, engine idling. I might not have thought twice about it. Cars idled on this street all the time, waiting for ride shares or double-parked deliveries, except that as I passed, the rear window lowered, slow and silent, and I found myself looking directly into Tajin's face for the second time in less than a week. I stopped walking. My podcast kept talking into my ear, tinny and irrelevant, until I fumbled it off. "You walk home alone," he said. Not a question, an observation, delivered the way you'd note a fact you found unacceptable. "I've done it every day for 2 years," I said, proud that my voice held steady even as my pulse hadn't. "It's a safe neighborhood. It's dark. It's 7:30. Something almost like amusement crossed his face, there and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "You're stubborn." "I'm careful. There's a difference." I glanced past him into the car, empty otherwise, no driver visible from this angle, though I assumed there was one, and then back to him. "Are you following me, Mr. Tajin?" I had business 2 streets over. His eyes didn't leave my face. "I saw you." I didn't believe him, not entirely, and something in the way he said it told me he didn't expect me to. But there was no aggression in it, no menace, only a kind of quiet certainty, as if he decided a long time ago that he didn't need to convince anyone of anything, least of all me. "I should get home," I said. "I'll walk with you." "That's not necessary." "I know." He opened the door anyway, unfolding out of the car with an economy of movement that made the whole street seem to still around him, the way it had in the ballroom. Up close, without the chandeliers and the noise, he was different. Quieter, somehow, though no less magnetic. He fell into step beside me without asking permission, and I found myself letting him, telling myself it was easier than arguing, knowing that wasn't the real reason. We walked in silence for most of the block. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, which surprised me. I'd expected tension, or the need to fill space with small talk, but instead there was something almost peaceful in it, like walking next to a low, steady fire. "The man from the gala," he said eventually. "Daniel. What about him? Are you seeing him?" It wasn't phrased as a question, but I answered it as one anyway. "We've been on 1 date. Not that it's your business." "It's my business now." I stopped walking. He stopped too, half a step ahead, turning back to look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not anger, not quite possessiveness. Something more complicated. something that looked almost like restraint wearing possessiveness's clothes. "You can't just decide that," I said. "You don't get to declare things about my life because you sent me a glass of champagne and gave me a ride I didn't ask for." "You're right." His voice stayed even, unbothered by my tone in a way that somehow made it land harder. "I don't get to decide anything about your life. Not yet." There it was again. That word. I felt it lodge somewhere behind my ribs, warm and unwelcome and thrilling all at once. "You keep saying that?" I said quietly. "Not yet. Like it's inevitable." "Is it not?" I didn't have an answer, and the fact that I didn't have an answer frightened me more than anything he'd said or done all night. We stood there under a street lamp that buzzed faintly overhead, close enough that I could see the small scar above his left eyebrow I hadn't noticed before. Close enough that the noise of the city seemed to recede into something distant and unimportant. "I don't know you," I said finally. And this time it came out less like an accusation and more like a confession. "I don't know anything about you except your name and what people whisper when they think I can't hear them." "What do they whisper?" "That you're dangerous. That people who cross you disappear. That you don't love anything, because loving something means it can be used against you." Something shifted in his expression. Not denial, not confirmation. Just a kind of stillness, as if I'd touched a nerve he'd long ago trained himself not to react to. "Some of that is true," he said. "Which part?" "I'll let you find out." He glanced past me toward my building, visible now at the end of the block, its lobby light glowing warm and ordinary against the darkening sky. "You're almost home. You're not going to answer me." "No." Then quieter. "Not tonight." We walked the rest of the way without speaking. At my door, he didn't try to come up, didn't ask for anything I wasn't offering, which surprised me more than if he had. He simply waited until I'd unlocked the outer door, until I was safely inside the small vestibule, before he spoke again. "Lock it behind you." "I always do." "I know." A ghost of something crossed his face, not quite a smile but close to one. "That's why I like you." And then he was walking back toward the car, unhurried, certain, leaving me standing in my own doorway with my heart doing something complicated, and my mind racing through every version of the conversation we'd just had, trying to understand what exactly I'd agreed to by not turning him away. I didn't hear from him again for 11 days. Those 11 days were strange ones. I went on a second date with Daniel. Dinner at a quiet Italian place 2 neighborhoods over. Pleasant conversation, easy laughter, nothing that should have felt wrong. Except twice during that dinner I caught myself glancing toward the door, some instinct half expecting, half hoping, to see a familiar dark coat and stillness at the edge of the room. He wasn't there. Of course he wasn't there. And yet the absence felt strangely loud, like a held breath. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I told myself that a man who dealt in the kind of business people whispered about, the kind of business that meant bodyguards and idling cars and reputations built on fear, was not a man I should be thinking about at all, let alone during dinner with someone kind and uncomplicated and safe. But safety, I was beginning to understand, had never made my pulse do what it did in that ballroom, under that street lamp, in the space of 2 quiet words. On the 12th day, I came home to find a small package waiting outside my apartment door. No note, no name, just a plain box wrapped in simple brown paper. Inside was a single worn paperback, a novel I'd mentioned once in passing, to no one but myself, thinking aloud in the volunteer hall 4 months ago about a childhood favorite I'd lost in the divorce and never replaced. I hadn't told anyone that. Not Priya, not Daniel, not a single soul. I stood in my hallway holding that book for a long time, my hands trembling for reasons that had nothing to do with fear, and understood, with a certainty that unsettled me more than anything he'd said or done so far, that Taijin had been listening far more closely than I'd realized, and that whatever door had opened in that ballroom was not going to close quietly, no matter how carefully I tried to shut it. I didn't call to thank him. I told myself that was the sensible thing to do, not engaging, not feeding whatever this was. But the truth was simpler and less flattering. I didn't have his number, and some stubborn part of me refused to ask Priya for it, as if not having it kept me one step removed from a decision I hadn't made yet. The book sat on my nightstand for 3 days before I opened it. When I finally did, I found a single line underlined in pencil, faint enough that I might have missed it if I hadn't been looking so carefully at every page. Some things find you whether you're ready or not. I didn't know if it was his handwriting, or if the book had simply come that way, already marked by some previous owner, and the not knowing kept me turning the question over at odd hours, in the shower, on the subway, in the gap between falling asleep and actually sleeping. Daniel called twice that week. I let one go to voicemail and answered the second out of guilt, agreeing to a third date I wasn't sure I wanted. The way you say yes to things, because saying no feels like admitting something you're not ready to admit out loud. We met at a rooftop bar downtown, the kind of place with string lights and overpriced cocktails, and a view of the skyline that was supposed to make everything feel romantic. Daniel was easy company, as always, funny in a low-key way, attentive, the sort of man my mother would have approved of instantly. I liked him. I want to be clear about that, because what happened next wasn't about Daniel doing anything wrong. We were maybe 40 minutes into the evening, my second drink half finished, when I felt the air shift again. I'd started to recognize it by then, that particular stillness that seemed to precede him, the way the smell of rain precedes a storm. I turned, almost against my will, and found him at the far end of the bar, not looking at me directly, deep in what appeared to be a low conversation with a man in an expensive suit, who kept nodding like every word out of Tajian's mouth carried the weight of law. 2 of his men stood near the elevator, watching the room with the same practiced disinterest I'd seen at the gala. He hadn't sought me out. That was the strange part. He seemed genuinely occupied, genuinely unaware of my presence, and for a moment I let myself believe this really was a coincidence, that the city was simply small enough for our paths to cross twice by accident. Then Daniel reached across the table and took my hand. It was such a small, ordinary gesture, the kind of thing people do on dates, a warm hand over cold fingers, punctuating some story about his sister's wedding. But I saw, from the corner of my eye, Tajian's head turn. Not fast, not obvious. Just a slow pivot, like a compass needle finding north, and his conversation with the suited man stopped mid-sentence. The suited man said something. Tajian didn't answer. He was looking at our joined hands, with an expression that made my stomach drop, somewhere between fear and a feeling I refused to name. "You okay?" Daniel asked, following my gaze. "Fine," I said, though my voice came out thinner than I wanted. Tajian excused himself from his conversation. I watched him do it, watched the suited man's face go carefully blank, the kind of blank that comes from being dismissed by someone you'd rather not disappoint, and walked toward us with a measured, unhurried gait that felt somehow louder than if he'd been running. "Madison." He said my name like it belonged to him, and I hated how much I didn't mind that. "Tajian." I kept my voice even. "This is a surprise." "Is it?" His eyes moved to Daniel, and though his expression didn't change, something in the room's temperature did. "Daniel." "You remember my name," Daniel said, and I could hear the effort it took him to keep his tone light. "I remember everything relevant." Tajian's gaze slid back to me, and for a moment the noise of the bar, the string lights, Daniel's hand still resting over mine. All of it seemed to fade into something distant and unimportant, the way it had under the street lamp 2 weeks ago. "Can I speak with you? Alone?" "Whatever you want to say, you can say here," I said, though my pulse was doing something complicated. Something flickered across his face. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of restrained frustration. The look of a man used to getting exactly what he asked for, and finding, for once, Resistance. Fine. His voice dropped, quieter, meant only for me, despite Daniel sitting 3 feet away. You're wearing his attention like it's harmless. It isn't. Men like him don't know how to protect what matters. They don't know because they've never had to. And you do? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. I know exactly what it costs to protect something. His eyes didn't waver from mine. I know what I'd do to keep you safe. He doesn't have the first idea. Daniel had gone very still, his hand tightening slightly over mine. Not aggressive, just instinctive. A man realizing he'd wandered into a conversation with rules he didn't understand. I think you should go, he said. And to his credit, his voice didn't shake. Taejin looked at him for a long moment, and I watched something pass behind his eyes. Not quite contempt, something colder and more controlled. The look of a man deciding, in real time, exactly how much restraint the situation required, and exercising precisely that much and no more. I'll go, he said finally, because Madison hasn't asked me to stay. His gaze returned to me. Not because you told me to. He left without another word, his men falling into step behind him as he crossed the rooftop toward the elevator, and the moment the doors closed behind him, the entire bar seemed to exhale. Conversations resuming at their normal volume, the string quartet of ambient noise filling back in where his presence had carved out a silence. What was that? Daniel said quietly. I don't know, I said. And this time it was almost entirely true. He's not going to leave you alone. Is he? I didn't answer, because I didn't have one. And Daniel, watching my face, seemed to read something there that I hadn't intended to show. He didn't say anything else about it for the rest of the night, but the warmth between us had cooled by the time he walked me to my door, and when he kissed my cheek goodbye, it felt less like affection and more like a formality neither of us quite believed in anymore. He didn't call again after that night. I told myself I wasn't disappointed, and mostly I believed it. 3 days later, I learned something that changed the shape of everything. I was leaving the office later than usual, the building mostly empty, elevator doors closing on a lobby lit only by the security desk's blue-white glow, when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Ms. Reyes, this is Officer Daniels, LMPD. Do you have a moment to speak regarding an incident on Cherry Street? My stomach dropped. Cherry Street was 2 blocks from Daniel's apartment. I called back immediately, standing frozen in the lobby, and the officer explained, in a careful, practiced tone, that a man matching Daniel's description had been involved in what witnesses called an altercation outside a bar 3 nights earlier. The same night, I realized with cold clarity, as the rooftop. He hadn't been seriously hurt, bruised, shaken, deeply frightened, according to the report, by 2 men who'd approached him in a parking garage and made clear, without ever explicitly threatening him, that certain choices had consequences. Did he give a description of the men? I asked, my voice unsteady now. 2 individuals, both declined to give names. Mr. Foster couldn't identify them beyond general appearance. He mentioned... The officer paused, checking notes. He mentioned they told him a name, Taejin. Asked if that means anything to you. I sat down hard on the lobby bench, my knees suddenly unwilling to hold me. It meant everything. It meant that whatever restraint I'd witnessed on that rooftop had been a performance, or at best a temporary ceasefire, and that somewhere beneath the quiet voice and the careful words and the underlined sentence in a second-hand book, there was a version of Taejin that didn't ask permission before acting on what he wanted. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with the lights off, staring at nothing, trying to reconcile the man who'd told me to lock my door with the man who'd apparently sent 2 men to frighten someone half to death in a parking garage for the crime of holding my hand. By morning, I'd made a decision. I found his number the only way I could think of, through Priya's fiancé, who knew someone who knew someone. the kind of chain that in this city always eventually led back to the same handful of powerful names. It took most of the day, and by the time the number came through, my resolve had hardened into something cold and certain. I called. He answered on the second ring, as if he'd been waiting. Madison. Did you have Daniel attacked? Silence, brief but telling. He wasn't attacked. He was warned. He was scared, Tajan. He thought he was going to be hurt. He wasn't hurt. That's not the point. My voice cracked, louder than I meant it to be in the small, dark kitchen. You don't get to do that. You don't get to decide who's allowed near me and then send people to threaten them when they don't listen. That's not protection. That's control. Another silence, longer this time, and when he spoke again, something in his voice had changed. Not defensive, not apologetic exactly, but quieter, more careful, as if he were choosing each word from a very small, very precise set of options. You're right, he said finally. I crossed a line. I hadn't expected that. I'd expected justification, deflection, the smooth confidence he wore like armor in every other conversation we'd had. This admission, plain and unadorned, caught me off guard. Then why did you do it? I asked, quieter now. Because the thought of him touching you made something in me I don't know how to control, he said. And for the first time since I'd met him, his voice carried something raw underneath the composure. Something that sounded almost like fear. Not of me, but of himself. I've spent my whole life learning restraint. I've never needed it the way I need it with you. I sat with that for a long moment. The phone pressed hard against my ear. My anger and something far more complicated tangled together in my chest. I need you to understand something, I said finally. I'm not a possession. I'm not something you protect by frightening people. If you want any place in my life, any place at all, it has to be because I choose it, not because you've made every other choice disappear. Silence again. Then quietly, I understand. Do you? I'm asking you to give me the chance to prove it. I closed my eyes, my kitchen dark and silent around me, the city humming faintly beyond the window, and understood, with a clarity that frightened me more than the phone call itself, that despite everything, the fear, the anger, the impossible weight of what I now knew he was capable of, I wasn't ready to say no. I didn't see him for 2 weeks after that phone call. It wasn't punishment, or at least I don't think it was meant as one. It felt more like space, deliberate and careful, as if he'd understood that pushing further right then would have cost him whatever fragile thing had survived that conversation. I used the time to think, which was both a blessing and a torment. I told Priya everything, sitting cross-legged on her couch with a bottle of wine between us, and watched her expression shift from fascination to genuine worry as I described the parking garage, the underlined book, the way his voice had cracked, just slightly, when he admitted he didn't know how to control himself around me. Madison. She set her glass down carefully. This isn't a romance novel. This is a man who had someone hurt because he was jealous. I know. Do you? Because you don't sound like someone who knows that. She reached over, took my hand the way she used to when we were younger, and I needed steadying. You deserve someone who doesn't need a warning label. I didn't have an answer for her, not one I was proud of, because the truth was more complicated than either fear or attraction alone. It was the fact that in a life I'd built entirely around safety, around small controlled choices that asked nothing of me and offered nothing back, Tajan was the first thing in 2 years that had made me feel entirely, uncomfortably alive. That didn't make it right. I understood that. But understanding something and feeling it are not always the same animal. On the 15th day, I found him waiting outside my building when I came home from work, standing beside the same black car, hands in his pockets, none of the usual stillness in his posture, instead something that looked almost like nerves, if a man like Taijin could be said to have such a thing. You didn't call, I said, stopping a few feet away. I said I'd give you space. I meant it. His eyes moved over my face, careful, searching. I wasn't sure you'd want to see me again. I wasn't sure either. I crossed my arms, less out of defensiveness now than to keep myself from doing something foolish like closing the distance between us entirely. You scared me, Tajan. Not the way you think. Not because I thought you'd hurt me. Because some part of me wasn't as afraid as I should have been. Something shifted in his expression. Relief, maybe, or something adjacent to it. I've spent 2 weeks trying to figure out how to prove I'm not the man from that parking garage. I don't think I can prove it with words. Then how? Come with me, one evening. If after that you want nothing to do with me, I'll accept it. I won't call. I won't send anything. I'll disappear from your life the way I should have from the beginning. I should have said no. Every rational instinct I owned was screaming at me to say no, to walk past him into my building and lock the door the way I'd promised him I always did. Instead, I heard myself say, one evening. He took me somewhere I didn't expect. Not a restaurant, not a gala, but a modest house on the edge of the city. Warm light in the windows, the smell of garlic and sesame oil drifting out to meet us on the porch. An older woman opened the door before we'd even knocked, her face breaking into a smile so genuine it startled me. This is my mother, Tajan said quietly. And for the first time since I'd met him, I heard something almost like uncertainty in his voice. I don't bring people here. His mother, a small woman with sharp, kind eyes, took my hands in both of hers and said something in Korean that Tajan translated, a little sheepishly, as, "She says you're prettier than he described, and he undersold you." Dinner was simple, homemade, nothing like the polished world I'd seen him move through in ballrooms and rooftop bars. He was different here. Not soft, exactly. That wasn't the right word. But unguarded in a way I hadn't witnessed before. Letting his mother tease him about his childhood, laughing quietly at stories that clearly embarrassed him. I watched him refill his mother's tea before she could ask. Watched him listen to her the way he'd once listened to me talk about a book I'd lost in a divorce I'd never mentioned to anyone else. After dinner, we sat on the porch steps, the city glowing distant and orange beyond the trees, and he was quiet for a long time before he spoke. My father built what I inherited, he said. He taught me that power only means something if you're willing to use it to protect what's yours. I believed that my whole life. I still do, in most ways. He glanced at me, something raw in his expression. But I'm starting to understand that protecting someone and controlling someone aren't the same thing, even if they can look identical from the outside. I didn't understand the difference until you pointed it out to me on the phone. I've been thinking about it every day since. That's not an apology, I said quietly. No. He held my gaze. I'm not good at apologies, but I fired the 2 men who went to see Daniel. Not because you asked me to, you didn't. Because I understood, finally, that if I want any place in your life, it can't be built on fear. Not his, not yours. I sat with that for a long moment. The porch light warm against the growing dark, his mother's laughter drifting faintly through the screen door behind us. I need you to promise me something, I said. If we do this, if this becomes something, you don't get to make decisions about who I see, who I talk to, what I do, without me. Ever. I don't care what world you come from. I won't live in a cage, even a comfortable one. I promise. His voice was steady, certain, none of the careful ambiguity he usually wrapped himself in. I won't ask you to be anything but exactly who you are. I only ask that you let me be part of protecting that when you'll let me. Not instead of you making the choice, but alongside it. It wasn't a perfect answer. It wasn't the kind of promise that erased 2 weeks of fear and a frightened phone call from a police officer I'd never met. But it was honest. And after everything, honesty from a man who'd spent his whole life speaking in silences and half-sentences felt like the most vulnerable thing he could have offered me. We didn't kiss that night. He walked me to the car, and at some point, without either of us quite deciding to, our hands found each other, his fingers lacing through mine with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with everything I'd been warned about him. It was such a small thing. It felt enormous. The weeks that followed were slow, careful, both of us learning a new language neither of us had been taught. He introduced me, gradually, to pieces of a life I'd only glimpsed from the outside. Not the parts people whispered about, but the ordinary corners of it. A favorite noodle shop near his childhood neighborhood. A rooftop where he went, rarely, just to be alone with the skyline. I learned that the tattoos disappearing beneath his collar told a story he'd never fully explained, but that clearly cost him something to carry. I learned that his silences weren't emptiness, but restraint, a lifetime of learning to say less, because less could never be used against him. He never told me he loved me, not directly. It showed instead in smaller things, the way he memorized my coffee order without ever asking, the way he showed up, quietly, at the edge of difficult days without being summoned, the way he'd stopped bringing bodyguards when we were alone together. A small, deliberate vulnerability I understood, without him explaining, as its own kind of confession. Then, on a Thursday in late autumn, everything I'd built with him nearly came apart. I was leaving a client dinner downtown, alone, later than I should have been, when a car pulled up beside me on an empty street. Not his car. Unfamiliar, dark windows, moving too slowly to be anything but deliberate. A man stepped out before I could react, grabbing my arm hard enough to bruise. Another appearing from the passenger side. And for one terrifying, breathless moment I understood, with total clarity, that whatever world Tajian lived in had just reached out and found me directly. "Tell your boyfriend," the first man said, his grip tightening, "that Cho sends his regards. Tell him the Song family isn't finished." Then, as quickly as it started, headlights flooded the street. Another car, fast, precise, and the men released me and scattered before I even registered rescue arriving. I stood there shaking, my arm throbbing, as a familiar figure emerged from the second car, moving faster than I'd ever seen him move, his composure entirely gone for the first time since I'd known him. Madison. Tajian's hands found my face, my shoulders, checking for injury with a franticness that would have been almost funny if my heart hadn't still been hammering with fear. "Are you hurt? Tell me you're not hurt." "I'm okay," I managed. "I'm okay, Tajian. I'm okay." He pulled me against him then, and I felt something in him shaking too, a tremor he was trying and failing to control. His arms locked around me like he could will the last 5 minutes out of existence through sheer force of holding on. "I should never have let you walk anywhere alone," he said into my hair, his voice raw in a way I'd never heard from him. "I should have—" "Don't." I pulled back enough to look at him. "Don't you dare turn this into another cage. This wasn't your fault. Someone did this to hurt you through me. That's not the same as you failing to protect me." He looked at me for a long moment, something fracturing and rebuilding behind his eyes. And then, for the first time since I'd met him, I watched Tajian. Controlled, silent, untouchable Tajian. Struggle to find words at all. "I love you," he said finally. Quiet, unguarded, the words falling out of him like something he'd been holding back so long it hurt to release. "I've loved you since the volunteer hall." I didn't know how to say it without it sounding like a claim instead of a truth. But it's the truth, Madison. It's always been the truth. Standing on that dark street, shaking, safe now in arms that had just proven willing to tear the city apart to reach me, I understood that whatever came next, whoever this Cho was, whatever danger still lingered at the edges of his world, I wasn't going to face the choice in front of me with fear anymore. "I love you too," I said, and felt him go still against me, the words landing somewhere I don't think he'd let himself believe they'd ever reach. "But this can't happen again. We need to end whatever this is. All of it. The Song family. The threats. The danger. The reason two men just grabbed me on a public street. I won't live like this. I know, he said. I've already started. He told me everything that night, sitting in my kitchen with 2 cups of tea neither of us drank, his hands wrapped around the mug like he needed something to hold on to while he spoke. The Song family had been a rival organization for 2 generations, an old, bitter rivalry inherited rather than chosen, the kind of conflict that outlived the reasons it started. Cho, the man whose name the stranger had invoked on that dark street, was the current head. Ambitious, reckless, looking for any opening to challenge Taejin's territory and reputation. My existence in Taejin's life, once it became known, had apparently become exactly that opening. A place to strike where it would hurt most, precisely because it wasn't guarded by the usual defenses. I've spent 6 years keeping the peace with them, Taejin said quietly. Not because I was afraid of Cho, because peace, even an ugly one, protects more people than war does. But peace only works if both sides want it. He looked up at me, something hard and resolved settling into his expression. The version of him I imagined existed in every room I wasn't allowed to see. He doesn't want it anymore. Not since he found out about you. So what happens now? Now I end it properly, not with more violence in the streets. That's what he wants. Chaos he can hide inside. I end it the way my father should have years ago, if he hadn't been so afraid of what peace might cost him. He reached across the table, closing his hand gently over mine. I need a week, maybe 2. I need you to trust me, even though I know I haven't earned unconditional trust yet. I need you somewhere safe while I do this. Define safe. My mother's house. Guarded, but not a cage. You can leave whenever you want. I'm not asking you to disappear, Madison. I'm asking you to let me finish something before it finishes us. I thought about Priya's warning on her couch, about the officer's careful voice on the phone, about the 2 men grabbing my arm on an empty street. I thought, too, about the porch step and his mother's laughter and the way he'd said, "I love you," like it had cost him something enormous to finally set the words down. Fear and trust sat uneasily together in my chest. But for the first time, trust won out, not blindly, but because I'd watched him choose honesty over control every time it mattered these past weeks. 1 week, I said, and you call me every day. Not your men. You. Every day, he agreed. The week that followed was strange in its ordinariness. His mother's house became a kind of quiet sanctuary. She taught me to make the dumplings I'd eaten that first dinner, badly at first, laughing at my clumsy folds until I improved. And in the long afternoons I found myself, unexpectedly, at peace in a house that belonged to a world I'd once been warned to fear. Taejin called every night, as promised, his voice tired but steady, telling me only what he could, that meetings were happening, that old alliances were being called in, that the resolution he was building wasn't going to look like anything from a movie. No dramatic confrontation, no gunfire in warehouses. Business like this ends in rooms with lawyers and old men who remember what war cost their fathers, he told me once, almost wry. It's less romantic than you'd think. I don't need romantic, I said. I need you to come back. On the 9th day, he did. He came to his mother's house in the early evening, and I knew before he said a word, from the set of his shoulders, from the way some invisible weight seemed to have lifted from him, that whatever he'd been carrying these past days had finally been put down. His mother took one look at his face and disappeared quietly into the kitchen, leaving us alone in the small living room. It's done, he said. Cho stepped back. There was a cost. There's always a cost in this world. But no one else gets hurt because of me, because of us. It's over, Madison. What kind of cost? Territory, money, pride, mostly, which men like Cho value more than either. He crossed the room, sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the day's exhaustion radiating off him like heat. I stepped back from parts of my father's business I never wanted in the first place. I've been looking for a reason to for years. You gave me one worth choosing. I studied his face for a long moment, the tension gone from his jaw. Something almost peaceful settled where I'd only ever seen careful control before. You're serious. It's actually over. It's over. He took my hand, turning it over gently in his, tracing the line of my palm with his thumb like he was memorizing it. I'm not going to pretend I'm an ordinary man, Madison. I'll never be that. But I can promise you a life that isn't built on fear. I've spent this week making sure of it. And Daniel, the men who compensated, quietly. He won't be bothered again, and he doesn't know why, which I think is the mercy he'd prefer. A faint, almost embarrassed smile touched his mouth. I also may have arranged anonymously for a rather generous donation to the children's hospital where we met. It felt appropriate. I laughed despite myself, some of the tension of the past 2 weeks finally loosening in my chest. That's oddly sentimental for a Mafia boss. Don't tell anyone. His smile faded into something more serious as he studied my face. I need to ask you something, and I need you to know you can say no. I won't hold it against you. I mean that. Ask. He reached into his jacket and produced a small velvet box, and my breath caught somewhere in my throat before he'd even opened it. Inside was a ring. Simple, elegant. Nothing like the ostentatious jewelry I'd half expected from a man of his world. The kind of ring chosen by someone who'd been paying close, careful attention to what I actually valued. I'm not asking you to marry a business, or a name, or a reputation, he said quietly. I'm asking you to marry the version of me that exists in my mother's kitchen, and on porch steps, and in every ordinary moment I've had with you these past months, that meant more to me than anything I built before I met you. I love you, Madison, not as something to possess, as someone I choose, every day, for exactly who you are. I looked at him, at the tattoos disappearing beneath his collar, at the careful stillness that had once frightened me, and now felt like home, at the raw honesty in his face that had taken months of fear and doubt, and one terrifying night on a dark street to fully surface, and understood that the door that had opened in that ballroom, the one I'd been so afraid I couldn't close, had never needed closing at all. It had only needed walking through. Yes, I said, and felt him exhale like he'd been holding his breath for weeks. Yes, Tajan. He slid the ring onto my finger with hands that weren't quite steady, a small human tremor from a man who controlled every room he ever walked into. And then he kissed me. Soft, unhurried, nothing like the tension that had crackled between us across ballrooms and rooftop bars. Just quiet certainty. 2 people finally arriving somewhere they'd been walking toward from the very first night. 6 months later, the wedding was small, held in the same modest backyard where I'd first eaten his mother's cooking, string lights instead of chandeliers, the smell of garlic and sesame oil drifting from the kitchen instead of expensive champagne. Priya cried through the entire ceremony, whispering afterward that she still thought I was insane, and also that she'd never seen me look happier. Both statements delivered with equal conviction. Tajan's mother held my hands the way she had that first night, tears in her eyes, saying something in Korean that Taijin, standing beside me in a plain gray suit instead of his usual severe black, translated with visible emotion. She says she prayed for someone who could see past what he does to who he is. She says her prayers took their time, but they were answered. I thought, standing there in the golden evening light, about the woman I'd been 8 months earlier, stepping off an elevator in a borrowed sense of confidence, holding tight to a stranger's arm, because it felt safer than standing alone. I thought about invisibility and safety, and how I'd mistaken the absence of risk for the presence of peace. Taijin still moved through certain rooms with the same quiet authority, still commanded a kind of respect that made people lower their voices when they spoke his name. That part of him hadn't disappeared, and I'd stopped expecting it to. But I'd learned. in the month since that night on the dark street, that authority and gentleness weren't opposites, that a man could hold immense power and still choose, every single day, to set it down gently in my presence, to ask instead of decide, to protect without controlling. He caught me watching him across the yard, deep in conversation with Priya's fiancé, and something passed between us. Not words. We'd never needed many of those. Just a look that carried everything neither of us had known how to say in that ballroom months ago. He excused himself and crossed to where I stood, sliding his arm around my waist with the same careful, deliberate warmth I'd come to know as entirely, uniquely his. "Regrets?" he asked quietly, echoing a question he'd asked once before, in a different life, under a different set of circumstances. "None," I said, and meant it completely. Not one. He didn't say "I love you" again in that moment. He didn't need to. It was there in the way he held me against the fading light, in the ring on my finger, in the quiet, hard-won peace of a life built not on fear or possession, but on a choice made freely, over and over, by two people who'd finally learned the difference between holding on and holding tight. The door I'd been so afraid to walk through had led somewhere I never could have predicted, and standing there in my mother-in-law's backyard, surrounded by string lights and the people I loved, I understood, at last, exactly what "not yet" had always meant. It had meant soon. It had meant when you're ready. It had meant all along, someday, if you'll let me. And I had. And I never once looked back.